however long. So first of all, just to say thanks to Roberta and to the TaPRA executive for giving us this platform today, and also to say thanks to Jerry Dabu, who, as many of you will know, had a hip operation recently and would have been part of this panel, but I think only first left her house yesterday. But she's here with us in spirit, and she sent a tweet to that effect, didn't she? So I'm going to chair, and I'm just going to talk for a few minutes just to kind of contextualise what we're here to talk about. So I've been in British academia since 1997, and I came into academia with a specific remit in my head to document and analyse Black British theatre history. It started off Black British women's theatre history, and broadly speaking, to place conversations about representations of Black experience, race relations, the intersection with gender and sexuality at the forefront of all my research and my teaching. When I came into this role, there was only one other Black woman, to my knowledge, which was Chukwuma Ewu, who was working on African theatre at University of Northampton. And although I now identify as non-binary, for many years I was in this lonely position of being the only Black British woman X to have a full-time job at a drama department in the UK. And as I speak now, there's me, there's Marge, there's Winston. They're the other two people that I know of. So the numbers are still pretty low. And when I started to do this research, I came into it thinking about gaps. Thinking about there's a clear gap in British theatre scholarship in terms of work that's looking at that intersection of race, gender and sexuality. Of course, we all like to think of our research in terms of gaps. We're all kind of looking at gaps in some sort of way, but the Black British woman X theatre gap is a seriously big gap. With respect here is Elaine Aston's An Introduction to Feminism Theatre, and at the time also Elizabeth Goodman's Contemporary Feminist Theatres to Each Her Own. So they were ostensibly about feminist theatre, read white feminist theatre, but they both included a chapter on Black women, and I give props to them at that time for starting that conversation, and also to the people, Nadine Holsworth and many others of you in the room, that kind of just introduce and include Black work within a kind of broader framework of what you're looking at. So I've rarely stood outside of my work to talk about the significance of what I've been doing. I just did the work, did the analysis and did the work. And to make sure, just certainly in my research, that my research is more inclusive of Black work and that it includes conversations about race. But we're in a particular moment now, aren't we, where diversity, or diversity, as I prefer to say it, but not in this context, diversity and inclusivity are at the forefront of agendas in theatre industry and in academia. So we heard yesterday about Dear White Central, we've got Why is my professor white, Rose Must Fall, all of that sort of stuff that's inviting us to have conversations about our curriculums and our research practices. But one of the things that's really interesting me recently is really the question of how we can talk about race and talk about inclusivity, both in terms of how they're kind of represented on stage, but how we can kind of engage in that conversation, because it's not always an easy conversation. There's been lots of books published recently, haven't there, that are kind of addressing this and are kind of giving us the tools through which we can talk about race. The most famous being Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, which I'm sure many of you will have read and will already be using in your teaching and in your research. But talking about race is not easy, and talking about race as a Black person in front of a room full of, I don't know what the percentages is, 98% white people is not easy, even harder. I'm going to skip on. So for that reason, I'm really pleased to say that things are starting to change, and we've got a panel in which we can start to talk about race. We've got 4 speakers. We've got Victor Lajon de Guevara, Pratna Perkayastha, Royona Mitra, and Tom Cornford. And each of them is going to give us just a 5-minute or 6-minute provocation, as you would have seen from the abstracts in the book. The idea is that they will each talk about their area 5 minutes. We'll hear all of the papers, and then we want to open up that conversation in order to kind of think about how we can move forward the discussion around decolonizing our discipline. Just by way of a sort of another context for this, the idea for this panel came out of a meeting that all of us attended this time last year or so, maybe a bit earlier last year, here at the University of Essex, Exeter, which Jerry Dabu set up. And it was specifically around kind of what we can do to decolonize the curriculum. And a couple of the ideas that we had were that we are going to try and develop a website that has got resources that you can all look at that will help you in your teaching and in your research. And then the other idea was to have this kind of curated panel. In the interim, we also did a London Theatre Seminar event back in May. Theatre studies, dance studies, performance studies is too white, where some of us presented as well. And my kind of motto, I guess, at that event was that if race isn't there in your curriculum or your teaching, just add it. It's easy, you just add it. You do like the people that I've already referenced are doing, you just add it. Just do it. It's really not that difficult. So in the interest of time, I'm going to kind of move over to our 4 provocations, and we're going to start with Royona.
Thank you. Thanks, Lenny. So I've titled my 6-minute provocation as Making Space in Dance, Theatre and Performance Studies, an Act of Decoloniality. In their book, Taking Up Space, The Black Girls' Manifesto for Change, recent Cambridge graduates Chelsea Kwakye and Ogunbiyi write, and I quote, "As a minority in a predominantly white institution, taking up space is an act of resistance. And in higher education, feeling like you constantly have to justify your existence within institutions that weren't made for you is an ongoing struggle for many people." End quote. Their resistive call to taking up space speaks boldly and urgently to students of colour to proactively disrupt and decenter the predominant whiteness of the academy with their presence and their activisms. But as educators who take up space in these institutions, how are we implicated in this call? What has space got to do with social justice in the academy and higher education? The production and organization of space in our institutions is fundamentally linked to power. And as such, these are social and political tasks that matter. Over the last 2 years, I have been heavily involved in Brunel's initiatives to close the attainment gap, as I'm sure so many of you in here have, between white students and our students of colour. During discussions that question the reasons for this attainment gap, many colleagues are unwilling to even consider, let alone acknowledge, that the white Westernness of their reading lists and curriculum content are potential catalysts for this gap. When these issues are brought to the fore, invariably the response is, there is just not enough space in the curriculum. What does this declaration about this deemed lack of space in the curriculum really mean, apart from the reluctance to relinquish space? Dance scholar Naya McCarthy-Brown reminds us that, and I quote, "One reason diversifying dance in the academy has been a challenge is that stakeholders lack a willingness to relinquish space for people of colour in significant ways," end quote. In other words, it isn't so much that there isn't space, it's that there is an unwillingness to give up some of that space currently occupied to accommodate perspectives and realities that have been so far marginalized. Perhaps what makes the prospect of making space for others feels potentially threatening. It's because it's the space that you have to surrender of your own to make this possible. I remember this threat quite viscerally after the birth of my daughter, as her baby paraphernalia flooded our once minimalist and tidy home. I remember my partner sensing my resentment and explaining that I had to make space for her. Not just by finding creative ways to store her newly acquired crap, but by getting rid of some of my own. Making space for Hira involved dividing the finite space of our home, once occupied by 2, now by 3, in order to give each of us an equal footing. And an equal footing is at the heart of my intervention today. Today, I put a call out to each and every one of you to give up some of the space that you and your work currently occupies, while fully acknowledging that this will feel threatening. I urge you to do so with a view to making space for practices, voices, embodiments, philosophies, critical concepts that are beyond the predominantly pervasive white, Euro, and US-centric reference points. I also want you to consider that making space does not equate with the diversity agenda that has hitherto manifested in our fields faculty meetings as, let's just add some more of those optional modules that deal with other content into the program. I echo here the Australian Indigenous scholar Tanya Kanyas's position that diversity is a white word, a project that has encouraged inclusions, curations, and endorsements of palatable differences only as sanctioned by the fixed center that is whiteness. Making space is therefore not so much about creating supplementary content, because space is after all finite. Instead, it's about reorganizing the space that is available to accommodate content and perspectives that you may have consciously or subconsciously considered as less valuable. Making space, then, has the potential to decenter and reorient the way in which we understand our fields. If, for example, you are writing on immersive performance scholarship, have you considered engaging with critical Indian scholarship from the Natya Shastra that has long conceptualized immersion way beyond participatory practices? It's really just not good enough to say that there isn't any space. There's always space. One just has to be willing to declutter, as I learned, and remove what is important to oneself in order to let in and engage with what is integral to someone else. And so I end with a few questions for you all. How can you collectively make space in our editorial boards, our awards committees, our university management structures, our peer review systems, our curriculum design, our edited anthologies, our citational practices, our calls for papers, our classroom pedagogies, so as to disrupt and displace this fixed center? What resource implications must be considered to make space in these ways? To the postgraduate research students in the room, how might your education equip you differently if its pervasive white Westernness were to be exposed and decentered from the beginning? And finally, what are each of you willing to give up? What you consider vital in your own teaching and research in order to make space for equally important but hitherto marginalized narratives and realities? Thank you.
Thank you, Royona. We move quickly on to Tom Cornford.
In his essay, The Neoliberal Revolution, Stuart Hall concludes that in ambition, depth, impact on common sense, and shift in the social architecture, neoliberalism does constitute a hegemonic project. Whiteness likewise constitutes a hegemonic project, and in spite of its longer history, one which is ongoing. As Hall observes, no project achieves hegemony as a completed project, and the project of hegemonic whiteness therefore has, to borrow his words, constantly to be worked on, maintained, renewed, revised. This is the starting point for any anti-racist politics, not only the analysis of racism in general, but of its specific structures and mechanisms. The mechanisms I will briefly address here today are the languages in which we conduct our research, articulate our findings, and evaluate each other's work. In so doing, I must stress Gramsci's emphasis on hegemony's dependence for success on only minimally active consent. This is why we are able to have, in the words of the sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva, racism without racists. Whiteness, as a hegemonic project, does not require active, conscious participation for its promulgation. Intent is not a requirement of racist systems. In fact, the main function of intentional racism in relation to hegemonic whiteness is to divert attention from its structural project, which requires only our deference to succeed. Think of Debbie Tucker Green's choice to use lowercase initial letters for her name. Even this tiny refusal to defer to linguistic systems is routinely either corrected or policed in phrases like, as she insists on styling herself, by reviewers of her work. There is a danger in this analysis, of course, that deference becomes unconscious bias, ushering in its reassuringly impregnable defense that my racism isn't real racism because I didn't mean it. Framing racism as a form of prejudice doesn't only serve to protect individual white people from accusation, however. It also functions, as Ashley Jardina has shown, to protect the material interests of white people as a social formation. White identity and white consciousness are quite distinct from racial animus, she writes. Their predictive power lies primarily in the domain of policies that protect whites and their status. Deference may seem a slight matter, but its ease conceals what is at stake in its operation, the racialized material interests of white people. Language sustains those interests in numerous ways. It structures thought hierarchically. Our research has subjects, and the centering of those subjects marginalizes others. Thinking, as Bell Hooks proposes, from the margins, therefore requires not only reconsidering value systems that promote particular subjects, but active resistance against language's pull to the center. Language also routinely objectifies or instrumentalizes those it marginalizes, who are done to or with. Language anticipates an addressee. Scholars who speak and write about theatre makers of colour routinely find their word limits used up in description for an audience that they cannot assume will know their material. Furthermore, an anticipated addressee has anticipated lexicons of argument and citation by which thinking is rendered legible to them. All of these structures pull us into discourses shaped by whiteness. Language, however, is not only an explicit structure. It also functions implicitly as a system of allusion, subtext, and connotation, which has also been historically shaped. Seemingly unremarkable terms such as black comedy, or the use of the word dark to signify a bleak or sinister condition, are unavoidably racialized, as is the term flesh color, which I recently unsuccessfully requested an author to remove from an essay. Last week, I also removed the word slavish, used as a qualifier for adherence, from an essay by an author whose own institution notably owes its existence to profits generated by the slave trade. These examples are not, however, simply crass, although they certainly are that. They also work ideologically to sustain hegemonic whiteness. As Toni Morrison observed, that the culture, the imaginative and historical terrain upon which early American writers journeyed is in large measure shaped by the presence of the racial other. Language is also easily appropriated. The term throwing shade, for example, was developed by gender non-conforming people of colour in New York to describe a non-verbal response to abuse. The term woke referred to an African American who had developed an awareness of the systemic function of racial and social injustice. When these phrases are adopted into the language of whiteness, two things happen. First, their meaning is subverted. Throwing shade refers to any minor act of ironic subversion, and was even used to describe the shitty eye rolls of embarrassed aristocrats faced by an African-American preacher at a royal wedding. And woke has become a stick to beat privileged white social justice warriors on Twitter. Second, this subversion of meaning serves to erase both histories of oppression and the labour of political self-education and resistance which these terms identified. Thus, through its structural, hierarchical, connotative and appropriative functions, language sustains hegemonic whiteness, and it is therefore only by undoing language that an anti-racist politics of research can become possible. Thank you.
Thank you. So we move on to Victor Ladron de Guevara, who's going to continue that talk about language by talking about accents.
Thank you. Discussions regarding decolonization and/or diversity are often prefaced by the need to allow the emergence of different voices. Yet, there is a distinct lack of recognition and attention paid to those voices who speak with an accent. Accents, in general, are a thorny, complicated, and overlooked matter that deserve to be analyzed in more depth. As most UK residents are aware, accents are a central and sensitive phenomenon within British culture. Accents are not only intrinsically linked to a predominantly generic, regional, or geographic adscription, but they also serve as heightened markers that, purportedly, frame individuals and their interactions with their interlocutors. It is impossible for me to claim that this is true in all contexts, yet, at least in the UK, accent serves to establish that which is deemed to be normal or neutral, and that which is other, or better said, that who is another. Regional and class differences are encoded within the performance of an accent, defining the accented individual in their opposition or fulfillment of a nebulous British standard. RP has played a particularly important role in this process and had asserted itself within British cultural reality in such an efficient and deep way that its use became the standard in both the media and the British stage. Thus, to speak well, it's still often equated to master RP, a process that continues to this date in the training received by actors in numerous drama schools and conservatoires. It is true that there has been a patent emergence of regional accented voices during the last few decades in the media, yet the absence of non-English voices who speak English with foreign accents in both the British media and the British stage is frankly dumbfounding. There are, of course, exceptions to this. Venezuelan actor Gladys Ibarra, recently playing Dolores in the Cervantes Theatre London production of Yerma, and playwrights such as Debbie Tucker-Green, who have written roles in which characters speak with non-English accents, as is happening in Random, for example. Yet, paraphrasing Hall in his discussion regarding Black representation, foreign accents in the English stage media have typically been the object, but rarely been the subject. For the most part, accents are either performed on a stage by individuals who imitate them or by actors who possess them and have been casted on that role because of their linguistic proximity to the character they perform. A proximity that can be real, but in most cases, just mistakenly imposed. For me, this opens two main issues regarding representation of those who are different that are common to other minorities. Firstly, the ability to imitate an accent has some traces of that process through which a neutral actor can disguise themselves as someone from a different nationality or ethnicity, which has strong echoes of those processes that we know as black-facing, brown-facing, yellow-facing, etc. Secondly, those non-English voices, the ones that do have a foreign accent, are predominantly typecast and with very few opportunities of employment in the industry, in a process that often reasserts notions of authenticity and of certain fetishization of the other. That is a process that always reaffirms that which we already knew about them. It is important to point out that historically there are exceptions in this process. In France, for example, one of the distinguished characteristics of Maria Casares was her accent, as was pointed out extensively by Maria Delgado. It is equally important to clarify that this is a historical problem and that the aversion to accented voices is nothing new either. One of the earlier criticisms to the actors performing Peter Brook's Mahabharata, of all things, was their intelligibility and cacophonic accents. Yet, the fact that a profoundly multinational, multicultural society such as the UK have had so many issues integrating a sizable section of its population into its artistic and mediatic representations is rather revealing and compounds that heightened sense of what is deemed to be ours and that which is deemed to be foreign. A process that perhaps is not that strange in a society that has narrowly decided to leave the EU. Yes, as Margarita Loera yesterday said, The presence of accented voices on the stage has the potential of creating spaces of difference and contestation and become an articulator of translation, a bridge between different cultural realities. For this to happen, however, we need to begin by acknowledging and nurturing those accented voices who inhabit our cities, our streets, and our teaching spaces. And please, let's re-examine the tendency to suggest or coerce students, foreign students, to speak their own language in our student productions, to cover our own perceptions, assumptions, and biases about what spoken English should sound like. Thank you.
Wow, so much already to be pondering. So our last provocation comes from Pratana Perkayastha on decolonizing archives and history.
In the winter of 1885, a group of 45 natives were shipped from India by Liberties of London, a luxury department store, to be installed as human exhibits in a living Indian village at the Albert Palace in Battersea Park. They were housed in squalid rooms, exhibited live in freezing conditions, and ultimately abandoned by their recruiting agents and producers. Led by a Nautch dancer, the group sought legal action in London's courts of law and finally returned to India starving, having lost a member of their group, but having forced British law to recognize the contractual obligations of the exhibition's producers. In my current historical and archive-based project titled Dance Remains, which argues for decolonizing archives, exhibition practices, and performance reenactments, I embrace the following decolonial maneuvers. The first is in response to the problem with a word such as dance and the problem of finding certain bodies when working within, against, and beyond the colonial archives. As established by several South Asian scholars, Srinivasan, Meduri, Soneji to name but a few, dance became both etymologically and ontologically suspect in British colonial India. I wish to highlight here the epistemic violence of the colonial term nautch, which was an anglicized corruption of the Hindi and Bengali word for dance, nach. I wish to draw attention to the cannibalizing force of this anglicized word, nautch, when it devoured and digested into one undistinguishable mass a vast range of dance practices from across the South Asian subcontinent in the 19th century. By 1947, in a free and independent India, nautch was successfully criminalized. So my first decolonial maneuver is to reclaim the word nach, and along with it, to rehearse the history of the Nachwalis, the prostitute dancers and courtesans who were pushed underground through Christian missionary discourse, British colonial law, and Indian nationalist reform movements. And part of this reclamation is to be suspicious of what the colonial archives tell us, to notice the fictions of history, as feminist theorist Saidiya Hartman reminds us, and when necessary, to write new fictions into history. The second decolonial maneuver is to recover with care. The names of the 45 natives in Liberty's human exhibit have now emerged through an official document which tells us which region of the Indian subcontinent each individual hailed from, and which also gives us their profession and age. In naming these 45 real people back to life, decolonizing becomes a retrospective act. It reflects on the past, but also brings into relief the historian's own position, privilege, and responsibility in narrating the subaltern's story in an ethically sound manner. The third decolonial maneuver that I propose is that we allow theatre, dance, and performance studies to invest more keenly in ideas of reparation, restitution, and repatriation. I'm often asked how far the trail of the 45 exhibited Asians can go, now that we have their names. Can Liberties of London be asked to publicly apologize? Can the families of the forgotten 45 be found? And can they be compensated? How far can our field go? So how do we ensure that decolonization is not a metaphor, as suggested by Tuck and Yang? I have proposed 3 necessary moves for rethinking the scope of certain kinds of performance research: reclamation, retrospection, reparation. Decolonial actions and gestures that unearth, unsettle, and undo the violence of history and the archives. But I would also like to suggest that decolonizing doesn't remain only in the realm of intellectual labor, and that we also attend to the affective labor of decoloniality. There is a tendency to assume that the task of decolonizing is a burden only for people of color to carry. At the concluding professional development workshop for Black, Asian, and minority ethnic academic and professional services staff from Royal Holloway and University of Surrey, a very senior member of Royal Holloway's executive, who was invited to respond to questions, asked a room full of Black and brown staff, "What can you do to make your white colleagues comfortable to talk about race and racial inequality?" Such bollocks accompany...
I was going to say that fox. I've been thinking that fox.
I mean, such bollocks accompany other seemingly innocent mistakes. For instance, on countless occasions, at board meetings, Skype and Zoom meetings, and conferences, I have been and continue to be confused with my fellow panelist, Royona Mitra. Apparently, we look alike. This is one of numerous examples of everyday racist violence that whiteness and the white academy normalizes. So if decolonizing is not a Black burden, but a collective responsibility that we all share, I ask, what burdens and responsibilities are you willing to carry to decolonize our field? Thank you.
Thank you. Such great provocations, all of you. So as has been the practice in this conference, I'm going to give you just 2 minutes just to kind of have a little conversation with people around you.